The past is real, but it is not permanent. It happened, yes, but it isn't happening now. And more importantly, it isn't you. Raf, that distinction is critical, yet so many people fail to make it. They confuse memory with identity. They carry their past experiences as if those experiences wrote their name in stone. I was abandoned, so I must be unlovable. I failed once, so I must be a failure. I was lied to, so I can't trust anyone. That's how people collapse the story of what happened to them into the story of who they are. But psychologically and philosophically, that collapse is a lie. Memory is not identity. It is reference. It gives context, not definition. It tells you where you've been, but it does not decide where you're allowed to go. Your identity, if it's going to serve you, must be rooted in something stronger than history. It must be rooted in intention, who you're becoming, not just who you were. But the human mind is naturally conservative in a certain sense. It prefers what is familiar, even when the familiar is dysfunctional. There's a certain emotional safety in repetition. Even when the past hurt us, it becomes a lens through which we interpret everything else. We become loyal to it, not because it's good, but because it's known. And that loyalty you begin to unconsciously seek confirmation of your past narrative in your present life. If you were betrayed before, you start expecting betrayal. If you were shamed as a child, you start interpreting silence as judgment. You shape your reality around your memory instead of your potential. That's how trauma becomes identity. It's how failure becomes character. Not because it has to, but because it's easier to let the past speak for you than to take on the burden of rewriting your own story. Now here's the problem. If your identity is based on your past, then your future is predetermined. You've surrendered your authorship. You're no longer living. You're reenacting, and you'll call it fate or bad luck or maybe even destiny. But really, it's just the inertia of unresolved experience. It's the emotional residue of things you never separated yourself from. And at some point, that has to stop. You are not what happened to you. You are what you decide to do with what happened to you. That's the philosophical fork in the road. You either become a container for the past, endlessly replaying it like a script you've memorized, or you become a creator, someone who uses the past as a foundation, not a ceiling. And that shift is a kind of rebirth. It's the moment when your memory no longer controls your identity, when it becomes fuel for insight, not a boundary for growth. Now, let's take this a step further. The past does not have agency. It cannot act, only you can. So if your past is still hurting you, it's not because the event is alive. It's because you're keeping it alive. Bias through your attention, through your beliefs, through your unwillingness to challenge the meaning you've assigned to it. And here's the truth, meaning is not static. It evolves. The meaning you gave to an event when you were sure or sure-woo or Arthur-woo, it doesn't have to be the same meaning you give it now. That's the power of maturity. You get to reinterpret your history in light of who you are today, not who you were when the wound was fresh. But to do that, you have to confront your past, not rehearse it. You have to bring it into the light, examine it, and then, if necessary, release it. That process isn't easy. It requires brutal honesty. It forces you to separate your core identity from your emotional story. But it's the only way to become free. Because until you do that, every new opportunity will be filtered through an outdated version of you. And the longer you hold on to that outdated version, the more your life will feel like it's happening to someone else, someone weaker, smaller, more broken than you truly are. You have to stop confusing familiarity with truth. Just because a belief feels comfortable doesn't mean it's right. And just because a memory feels vivid doesn't mean it deserves control. The only moment that deserves your full attention is this one. The moment where you get to choose. Not who you were, but who you will be. Not what you suffered, but what you will build. And that's what real freedom looks like. Not the erasure of your past, but the refusal to be reduced by it. Not the denial of pain, but the decision that pain will not have the final word. You are not your past. You are the force that interprets it and the will that transcends it. Change, real change, always requires sacrifice. That's a principle embedded deep within every psychological transformation. You cannot step into a new identity while clinging to the old one. And yet, that's exactly what most people try to do. They want the rewards of change without the cost of release. But here's the truth: if you want to move forward, you have to let go of who you used to be. You have to break the quiet, hidden loyalty you've formed with your former self. This idea might seem strange at first. How could you be loyal to a version of yourself that hurt you, limited you, sabotaged your progress? But that's exactly what happens. People become psychologically attached to their own dysfunction because it becomes familiar, predictable, safe. Even pain, when repeated enough times, starts to feel like home. And so they protect it. Subconsciously, they defend the identity they claim to despise, not because it's good, but because it's known. There's a kind of identity fatigue that sets in when you've spent years surviving. You build a personality around your wounds. You form habits to avoid triggers. You make choices that align with fear instead of potential. And over time, you forget that those choices were once responses to trauma. They weren't reflections of who you truly are. But the longer you live inside them, the more they feel like truth. That's where the betrayal must begin. Not a betrayal of your morals or values, but of your limitations. You have to betray the part of you that says, "This is all I'll ever be." You have to betray the identity that was built in self-protection, not self-expression. And that means grief. It means mourning the loss of your old story. Because even though that story hurt, it's the one you knew how to live in. Changing it means stepping into territory you don't yet understand. And that takes courage. From a psychological, this is called ego death. A moment when the self-image you've carried collapses under the weight of a deeper truth. It's painful, but it's also liberating, because once that old version of you dies, you're no longer bound by its expectations. You're no longer trapped inside the narrative you didn't even realize you were writing. This is also why many people self-sabotage when they begin to grow. The moment things start improving, the old self panics. It says, "This isn't who we are, we don't succeed, we don't trust, we don't thrive." And then, like clockwork, you find a way to fall back, not because you're weak, but because the former version of you feels threatened by your potential. Because to fully become who you could be, you have to allow who you were to die. And death, even symbolic death, is terrifying, but this is the cost of change. If you want a new future, you must be willing to disappoint your past. That means not explaining yourself to people who only knew the broken version of you. That means walking away from dynamics that fed your dysfunction. That means saying no to old temptations, not just because they're wrong, but because they're small. And you've decided you won't live small anymore. Philosophically, this is about transcendence. Not in the mystical sense, but in the very real, grounded process of rising above what was once your ceiling. Every time you betray your old self, you create space for a new self to emerge, one that is not rooted in fear, but in response, not in victimhood, but in authorship, not in survival, but in strategy. But let me be clear, this isn't about hating your past self. That's not the path. The old version of you, the one you're outgrowing, was doing the best it could with the information it had. You should thank it. It got you here. But now you know more, you see more, and you're responsible for more. So you don't destroy your old self out of bitterness. You release it out of wisdom, with gratitude, not shame. And that's where you begin to step fully into change. When you no longer carry the weight of the person you were just to keep others comfortable, when you stop negotiating with your limitations, when you look at the old version of yourself, not with judgment, but with resolve, and say, you don't get to make decisions anymore. I'm not you. Not anymore. That moment is transformational. Because once you stop defending your former self, you free the energy needed to build your future self. And that shift from defense to design is the heart of growth. That's where evolution begins. That's where real, lasting change takes root. Dirons, to become who you were meant to be, you must stop protecting who you used to be. Let the old self go, because it can't carry the future you were born to build. God. You are not responsible for the things that broke you, but you are entirely responsible for who you choose to become because of them. That's not a comfortable truth, but it's a liberating one. It marks the line between staying wounded and becoming wise, between being defined by the pain and reshaping it into power. We live in a world that often glorifies victimhood, not in the sense of genuine empathy, but in the subtle reward system that emerges around suffering. People learn, sometimes unconsciously, that if they stay in their pain long enough, they will be seen, pitied, maybe even praised for enduring. But there's a difference between honoring what you've been through and building your entire identity around it. If you're not careful, your past becomes your prison, comfortable, familiar, even justified, but a prison nonetheless. And the key that unlocks it is responsibility. Now, responsibility is often misunderstood. People hear the word and think of guilt or blame. But true responsibility isn't about assigning fault. It's about reclaiming authorship. It's the moment you say, no, I didn't choose what happened to me, but I will choose what happens next. That decision, conscious, difficult, and courageous, is the foundation of personal transformation. And it's also the death of every excuse you've ever made for staying the same. Philosophically, this is where the concept of agency comes in. Agency is the belief that you have the capacity to make meaningful choices, even in the face of suffering. And that belief, backed by action, is the only path to freedom. Without agency, life becomes something that happens to you, not something you shape with intention. You start to interpret your history as fate instead of what it really is, context. The problem is most people let their past become prophecies. They say things like, this is just how I am, or I've always struggled with this, or people like me don't change. That's not insight, it's self-handicapping, it's not truth, it's repetition. And repetition isn't growth. It's just familiarity dressed up as wisdom. Look closely at the habits you refuse to break, the patterns you excuse, the stories you keep retelling. They all serve something. Maybe they protect you from risk. Maybe they justify your inaction. Maybe they give you an identity when you're afraid to build a new one. But they also keep you exactly where you are. And staying where you are can feel safer than stepping into the unknown. Because here's the catch, taking responsibility means you can't blame anyone anymore. Not your parents, not your ex, not society, not trauma. You can acknowledge those things, you can understand their impact, but you can no longer hide behind them. Responsibility requires brutal honesty. It asks, what am I still carrying that no longer belongs to me? And even more painfully, what am I still choosing that no longer serves me? Because make no mistake, there comes a point when your pain stops being your fault, but starts being your choice. And that's a hard truth to swallow. But it's the only one that can change you. This doesn't mean dismissing what you've been through. Quite the opposite. It means honoring it enough to rise from it. It means using your scars not as excuses, but as instruction. Every wound becomes a teacher, every failure becomes feedback, and that shift in mindset from victim to student, from survivor to builder, is where the transformation happens. Think of the most admirable people in history, the ones we read about, study quote. None of them avoided hardship. In fact, their greatness was often forged in suffering. But what made them remarkable wasn't what they endured, it was how they responded. They made the decision to take full ownership of the story, even when the beginning was written in blood, betrayal, or abandonment. That's what real strength looks like. Not denial, not suppression, but redirection. The ability to take what should have broken you and use it as the very material that builds you. And here's the most empowering truth of all. Once you take full responsibility for your life, your past loses its power. It no longer dictates who you are or where you're going. You stop reacting to life and start directing it. You stop repeating old cycles and start designing new outcomes, because the future isn't created by your wounds, it's created by your willingness to grow from them. So the question is not what happened to you, the question is what are you going to do with it? Pain shapes you, but only you decide what shape it takes.